Howdy, this is Dr. Wessner. We're going to be talking about strong attitudes this week. And so basically the purpose of the chapter is going to be focusing on what strong attitudes are and how they influence message processing. We're going to be looking at a couple different theories to provide insight into the nature of strong attitudes and how important the implications of this are for persuading people. So what just exactly are strong attitudes? Do you have strong attitudes about things? Did you have strong attitudes about who was going to win the Super Bowl or who you're rooting for the Super Bowl? So like in sports or politics or religion or food or really any number of things you can have strong attitudes in. And so think about the strong attitudes that you have as we're going through this chapter and how those strong attitudes kind of came to be and how could they be persuaded to go a different route or not, and why that would be so difficult to do. Okay, so we're going to start it off with what exactly are strong attitudes. Okay, and so Krosnick and Petty in 1995 told us basically that strong attitudes are likely to persist over time. So they're going to be something that are long lasting. They're not something that's very short-lived and change easily. They do affect our judgments about things. Okay, so our attitudes, these strong attitudes, are going to affect how we think about new information that comes in, how we think about information we've encountered before, and those sorts of things. So it will affect our judgments about things, people, etc. They also guide our behavior, right? So if we have strong attitudes about things, typically it's going to affect how we behave, right? We may do things or not do things based on these strong attitudes that we hold. And finally, they do prove very resistant to change. In order for somebody to have a change or conversion from this strong attitude that they hold, there has to be something that really gets to that person that gives them a moment of pause to even think about reconsidering their position. Okay, so they are very resistant to change, and so that's what oftentimes why when we're trying to persuade people, we often don't seek out the ones that have the very strong attitudes because it's much harder to do. We typically are looking for the ones that are in the middle of the road, and that is when, right, we are typically aiming our persuasive efforts, but not always, right? Because it is very important to try to persuade people, or at least we think so, or at least the people that are trying to do the persuading think that it's very important that other people come around to their way of thinking or doing things or buying this product or whatever it is. And so they will not just leave the ones with the strong attitudes out in the cold per se, with their persuasive efforts, but they do realize going in that it's going to take different strategies, it's going to be more difficult, and it's going to be harder to do. Okay, so why are these strong attitudes so stable, basically? So they're really stable and persistent over time because they're anchored by our beliefs and values. If you remember talking about that in the previous chapter, right, those attitudes are kind of nestled right in there between our beliefs and values. And so because of that, there's a whole lot of things incorporated into our attitudes, right, that are hard to change. Right? Our values are very, very hard to change. And so that is going to influence those strong attitudes, right? It's going to really prevent them from being changed. They're also associated with more knowledge and attention. So if I have a strong attitude about pizza, let's say, and I only like certain types of pizza, well, this pizza will be the best, and this is why, and all of these other brands of pizza, not so much, right? I happen to be a huge fan of RX Pizza. I think it's one of the tastiest in town. Maybe, actually, I'm going to go with probably the tastiest. I haven't had them all yet. But it would take a lot of persuasive effort to persuade me otherwise. I've had other good pizza, but RX Pizza and Bryan is by far my favorite, okay? And pizza's a big thing in Indiana, where I'm originally from, so you know, I'd have strong opinions about and attitudes about pizza. Anyhow, that's just kind of like a fun way to look at at attitudes, right? So with pizza, right? If I have more knowledge about how I think pizza should be made, I pay more attention to it. I might make my own pizza at home, those sorts of things. I'm really in tune with that topic, right? I'm going to have a stronger attitude about it. If I'm just kind of ambivalent about it, right? Like, well, I like pizza, it's good, and I don't really have like a favorite per se, then I'm not going to have as much knowledge and I'm not going to pay as much attention to it because it's not something that is held so strongly, right? So if I have a strong attitude about something, I'm going to associate more knowledge with it. I'm going to be much more knowledgeable about it, and I'm going to pay more attention to it. And because of that, right, it's going to be more difficult or more resistant to those counter arguments that people might have. Also, right, attitudes will be strong oftentimes because of the other people that we surround ourselves with. So when we have a strong feeling about an issue, right, we may associate with others that also feel the same on these important issues to us. And this helps us to maintain and support our attitudes, right? So when we have discussions about it, we're hearing the same stuff over and over again. We're hearing the same evidence and the same arguments for why this attitude is correct, right? And so because of that, right, you're going to feel this network of support and all of these people agree with you, and so you're much more likely to hold on to that strong attitude as well. There also typically our strong attitudes tend to be more elaborated and accessible, meaning that it's more likely at the tip of our tongue, and this goes back to our association with knowledge and attention. The more knowledge we have, the more attention we pay to it, the more elaborated our arguments are, the more elaborated our evidence is, and the easier it is for us to just be able to easily respond to somebody's criticism, critique, or question. Also, if you have a strong attitude about something, you're likely to seek out additional information. It's typically something that you're very interested in, right? So if you have a strong opinion, like I said about pizza, right, I might be looking at all these different kinds of cooking blogs about different types of pizza and Sicilian and thin crust and wood-fired and all these different types of pizza. And so I'm going to seek out additional information. And so getting more of that information, going back to the knowledge and attention, right, is going to help me bolster my arguments and resist the attempt to be able to have somebody change my mind, okay? And if we go back to our different approaches when we're looking at attitudes, the symbolic approach suggests that people will acquire these strong attitudes at an early age. And they may indeed, however, change over time, but they may acquire them at an early age. And this especially goes to things that are culturally based. If you think about like religion or something like that, politics, something that is kind of culturally ingrained in that family or the area in which they live, then, right, you can see how acquiring a strong attitude at an early age would be easy to do. The ideological approach emphasizes that strong attitudes are likely to be organized around principles and values, right? So once again, going back to them being anchored by beliefs and values, that makes sense as well, okay? So the ideological approach makes a lot of sense. Social psychologists emphasize that strong attitudes are going to possess different attributes from these weak attitudes. And so we're going to look at those here in just a second in the next slide. But that is important to note that there is a difference between weak attitudes and strong attitudes, and the way in which we process information based on those attitudes will differ as well. So as stated previously, there is a difference between the attributes of weak attitudes and strong attitudes. So strong attitudes are going to be characterized by importance, right? We're going to care very deeply about the issue. It's going to be something that we're very interested in, something we're paying attention to, something we're seeking information out on, something that we hold very dear to our heart that's going to be anchored to those values and beliefs. Secondly, there is some ego involvement involved, right, with that, meaning that it's going to, basically, we're going to see it as part of our identity. It involves our core values and who we see ourselves as, right, when we think about who we are. And so because of that ego involvement, those attitudes are going to be held very closely because that's part of our identity and what makes us who we are. They are also characterized by extremity, right? So they're going to be on one end or the other, right? They'll strongly agree with something or strongly disagree. They are not going to be wishy-washy about it. Okay, so a strong attitude is characterized by an extremity of either a positive or negative. Fourth, we are certain that this is accurate and correct. We're convinced of it. It is going to be very hard for somebody to change their mind about the topic, about the idea that we're holding our attitude. And so we're going to be very convinced that our attitude is indeed correct. And this is also, part of what makes it so difficult to change. Fifth is the accessibility. The attitude comes quickly to mind. We don't have to think about it. It's automatic. We hear a word, we see an image, we see a headline, we turn on a certain station on TV, and it automatically triggers the attitude, right? It's automatic. There's no thinking about it. It quickly comes to mind. And then sixth is knowledge. We're highly informed about it, right? So we know a lot about the topic, about the person. We've done a lot of investigation about it. We look for information. We read a lot about it. And so that is definitely a characteristic of a strong attitude. Just think about it. If you have a weak attitude or you don't really care either way, right, kind of middle of the road, you aren't going to know a lot about it, likely, because you're not going to have investigated any additional time, effort, or energy into knowing about it, right? If you don't like pizza, you're not going to know a whole lot about pizza. So, or you're not a pizza enthusiast, we should say. Most people like pizza, right? But they might not be as knowledgeable about it because they're not an enthusiast about it per se. And then lastly, we have our hierarchical organization. So this is internally consistent and linked to other attitudes, right? So the attitude is going to be internally consistent with our values, beliefs, etc. And it's going to be embedded in this elaborate attitudinal structure. And so because of that, it also makes them very difficult to change, because if you change this one aspect, right, you have to change everything. So if you think of anybody that's had any sort of big change of heart about a subject matter or not, it doesn't just change their attitude on X. It changes their attitudes on A, B, C, D, and E. It's going to change their behavior on certain things. And so a lot of times an attitude can be tied internally to a whole lot of different attitudes, this elaborate attitudinal structure, which can cause changes in other attitudes as well, and even behaviors and lifestyles, etc. So the first theory that we're going to talk about with regards to attitudes and information processing is that of social judgment theory. So Sharif and Sharif in 1967 came up with social judgment theory. And basically what it says is that people are going to evaluate issues based on where they already stand on the topic. So if I feel strongly that RX Pizza, right, is the best pizza in town, I'm going to evaluate all other arguments based on what I think to be true about RX Pizza, right? So it's all going to be filtered through that lens. And so we're not only weighing the argument's quality, but we're comparing that position with our advocated position with their position. And there's these subjective judgments that are being placed about the various issues, right? So we basically are evaluating messages based on where we stand, not on the merits of the arguments, right? And so there's a lot of kind of an emotional, that evaluation part of the attitude there, how strongly or how good we think it is or how bad we think it is. And so we don't evaluate the message purely in a logical basis on the merits of the argument. Okay? So people are going to compare their advocated position with their attitude and then determine whether they should accept the position that's advocated in the message or reject it. Okay? And this theory has three core concepts that we look at. We look at the latitude of acceptance, rejection, and non-commitment. We also look at assimilation and contrast, and then also ego involvement. And so in the next 3 slides, we're going to look at each of those things. Latitudes is the first core concept of, right, social judgment theory. And so latitudes are basically going to be our attitudes along a continuum of evaluations, right? It's going to be a range of acceptable and unacceptable positions, as well as positions towards which the individual has no strong commitment. And so when we look at the continuum, we see that it does range from 0% to 100% agreement with our own position. So this is always in reference to our own position. And so the latitude of acceptance, the LOA, right? This is going to be all of the positions on an issue that an individual finds acceptable, including the most acceptable position. The latitude of rejection, or the LOR, this is going to include those positions that an individual finds objectionable, including the most objectionable position. And then the third option we have is the latitude of non-commitment, and this consists of those positions on which the individual has preferred to remain non-committal. So here we have a comparison of somebody with a strong attitude and one with a moderate attitude. So if you look at the strong attitude, we can see that you have a very limited, right, small amount of latitude of acceptance, right? So there's very few arguments or positions that we are going to find acceptable, because those are the ones that we find correct. The latitude of rejection, however, is going to be very large, right? So we see the LOR is ranging from 0 to 50, right? Where our LOA is ranging from 90 to 100. And then we see in the middle, right, the latitude of non-commitment, it has about a 20-degree range, so 60 to 100. So there's, there's more of those than there are of agreement, but definitely the latitude of rejection is much larger. If I have a more moderate attitude, as we see in the bottom section there, we see that, right, the LON is going to be the largest segment, the latitude of non-commitment. And that's because we don't have strong attitudes about it either way, right? And so we have this non-commitment position on the subject matter. So in this particular example, the latitude of rejection and the latitude of acceptance both have a range of about 20, where the latitude of non-commitment has a range of 40, so double that of either of the LORs or LOAs. So typically, as we see here, if you have a moderate attitude, the latitude of rejection, the latitude of acceptance is going to be more equal. Your latitude of non-commitment will be larger. If you have a strong attitude, your latitude of acceptance is going to be smaller. Your latitude of rejection is going to be very large. Okay? And so that's how the latitude aspect of this works. The second core concept of social judgment theory is that of assimilation and contrast, right? So this is talking about our perceptual mistakes or distortions. So if we're going to filter information and ideas and experiences and all those sorts of things through our standpoint of our expectations based on what our initial attitude is, right? And so with assimilation, we tend to basically pull a congenial message toward our own attitude, assuming that the message is more similar to our attitude than it really is, okay? So if we like somebody, or if they are similar in a lot of ways to us, right? If they say or do something, we're likely to be more agreeable with it than, let's say, if they were not a friend of ours. Okay, and in fact, if somebody else did it, we may even, think negatively of them, right? Or if I do it, it's okay, but if somebody else does it, it's not, right? Something like, let's say somebody pulled out in front of you while you're driving, or ran a red light, or were texting while driving, or anything like that. Something that you might do, but if somebody else does it, it's way worse, right? So that's more of the contrast. But if somebody else is doing it, like in the car while you're with them, but you like them, it may be more of an assimilation thing, right? So the assimilation is an overestimate of similarity between the congenial message, and our own attitude. So typically it's friends that have similar interests or attitudes that are similar. And so as long as it is in the latitude of acceptance or the latitude of non-committal, we kind of go with it, even if it's not really the same thing, right? Or similar to what we would think. In contrast to that, right, is contrast. So this is the overestimation of a difference between somewhat conflicting messages and our own attitude. So these are typically seen as in your latitude of rejection, right? Or your attitudes of foes. So if you think about a friend that has a very different opinion about something than you, right? You might actually estimate the difference that exists. You may actually be closer to one another than you thought on that standpoint, if you looked at a continuum. But because you know how they think about it already, you assume that that difference is greater than it might actually be. And so social judgment theory has very interesting implications for persuasion when it comes to comes to this, because persuaders are going to face a difficult task because our existing attitudes are serving as anchors and filters that we're filtering everything through. So when we evaluate these incoming messages, right, we already have our attitudes that are there, right? And then depending on who's saying what, right, you might filter that differently. For example, right, if you were to look at two different speeches by political figures, but you had no idea who said them or when they were said, right, you may think that the same person actually said both of them, right, and that they fell on one side of the spectrum or the other. However, that may not be the case. It could have been that 20 years ago, somebody on the left said X, and then 20 years later, somebody on the right said X, but the ones on the left, right, are saying that those statements are incorrect, even though somebody in their own party would have said the same thing 20 years ago, right? And so because of the context and who's saying it and the climate of things, you will see these different reactions to people just because of the person that is saying it. So, and this goes, we'll talk more about this later in the credibility, but it does have stuff to do with this assimilation and contrast, right? So if we have somebody that we know or that we don't like or that we disagree with, oftentimes it doesn't matter what they say if we're not truly willing to listen, because we just assume that whatever they're going to say is grossly and far apart from it's going to be in that latitude of rejection no matter what, when in fact they may actually be a lot closer to the same position if both of them would just kind of listen to each other. So it's kind of an interesting thing about the assimilation and the contrast. Ego involvement is the third core concept of social judgment theory. And basically, right, what's happening is that there's an arousal, either singly or in combination, of the individual's commitments or stands in the context of appropriate situations. And this ego involvement will have a strong impact on latitudes and the assimilation and contrast, so the other two core concepts. What we typically find is that ego involvement is going to touch on issues of basically your self-identity or self-concept. And so because of that, they people will hold on to those attitudes very near and dear, because if something conflicts with that and they end up changing their mind, right, there could be a lot of things in their life that they have to change. And so, because remember, these are strong opinions, strong attitudes. And so these attitudes, if they do end up having a big switch, because of the ego involvement, there's a lot. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard to change them, is because it's so much embedded in our identity. We can't imagine being a part of the other side of X issue. And so we rarely entertain the idea of any credence on the other side, right? So, and it has to do with that identity. So when you're have a high ego involvement, typically these people are going to have larger latitude of rejection than their latitude of acceptance and non-committal, which makes sense based on the latitudes that we saw earlier, right? They're going to reject nearly everything that doesn't match their prior attitudes. And so, because of the ego, this makes it very easy to do. And all of us, right, if we have strong attitudes about anything at all, that we could definitely be doing these sorts of things. They also are going to be, they also will only assimilate ambiguous messages when consistent. So if they hear an ambiguous message, right, it's going to be harder to persuade them on these latitudes of non-committal issues, right, that they have, because of the fact that it's not conforming basically to their latitudes of agreement. So if it's ambiguous, if it's consistent with their latitudes of acceptance, then that's fine. But if it doesn't appear to be congenial with that, then it's likely that it will stay non-committal, or even could push it into a latitude of rejection. Highly involved individuals also engage in selective perception. Right, so what this means is that they are going to selectively perceive events that fit into their preconceived beliefs and attitudes. So when they experience something, right, it's going to go through that filter, and they're going to automatically sort of like it or not like it more than the other. Also, they may not even pick up on things that would be in the latitude of rejection, okay? So because they're only looking, they're only perceiving, they're only allowing their attention to go to things that fit within their preconceived beliefs and attitudes. Also, so this, influences basically a biased assimilation of information. So if we have a biased assimilation, we're going to assimilate that ambiguous information to their point of view. So we're going to somehow believe that it's going to be more consistent with our position, right? If it's ambiguous and kind of meets that criteria, because we're filtering it through that information. People with strong attitudes, right, due to this selective perception, often will not search for information that would prove their position wrong. So they're not very likely, right, if you have a strong attitude about something, you're not going to be very likely to look for the other side's information and why they think that and what arguments they have. And so that they would engage in more of a biased search for that information. So we often will have basically kind of a biased blind spot when we have strong attitudes, and when we view our concerns and our rights in basically a sharper focus than those of the opposition. There are certain issues on which we're all biased and psychologically intransigent, okay? And social judgment research basically says that we will selectively perceive information, reject viewpoints that actually might be congenial to our own, and even assume that the communicator harbors hostile intentions. So if we're aware of this, right, if we know now, right, that this can happen, we can take steps to counteract our selective biases if we want to, right? So if that's something that you're looking to do, right, you're wanting to really critically evaluate information, you can at least be aware of it and then try to counteract those things. And the studies have shown, right, this is actually quite interesting, the research that's been conducted, that political biases are so strong that they can even manifest themselves in brain activity, right? So there's a couple studies they mentioned in your book that talk about that the reasoning areas of our brains shut down when they are considering information that is inconsistent with their political positions, and the emotional areas lit up brightly when processing constant information. And so we can see, right, especially if we have strong political positions, right, that there's actually brain activity that's associated with that, the contradicting information. The findings also suggest that the selective perception is a fundamental aspect of human psychology, extending beyond politics into other domains, such as partisan support for our sports teams, right? If you're a really big Pats fan or an Eagles fan, right, the Super Bowl was a huge, big deal yesterday, you might have been non-committal about it as well. Or being partisan, of course, for our dear Aggies. So anything like that, or food, if maybe you were very partisan about Lanes versus Canes or something like that, right? These sorts of things. So it's not just politics that it will extend to, it extends to other aspects of human psychology as well. And then the last part is engaging in selective exposure. So selective exposure is a norm, right? People select social worlds such as neighborhoods, friends, websites, blogs that are going to reinforce their pre-existing viewpoints, right? So when you seek out communication that embraces your worldview, that's engaging in selective exposure. It's completely normal. It's completely common. And that's how we learn about the different things that we like a lot, okay? And so people will tend to cluster or segregate by these attitudes because they want to be with people that think like them. So if you go back to 2004, right, they talk about in the book Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ and Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, grossing lots, millions of dollars at the box office. The top theaters for The Passion were located typically in Republican strongholds, the suburbs, and in the West, Southwest, and South, right? Whereas the highest grossing theaters for Fahrenheit 9/11 were located in urban, traditionally Democratic areas such as New York City, LA, and San Francisco, right? And so the studies that looked at that were, noticed that people were selecting, of course, to go see things that they agreed with or wanted to go see that they thought that they would like. So this can, just is an example of how that sort of works. Attitude accessibility is going to be the second theory that we look at with regards to strong attitudes. So basically what attitude accessibility is telling us is that attitudes are going to vary along a continuum of strength, right? This makes sense. Weak attitudes are going to be characterized by a familiarity with the object, but a lukewarm evaluation of its net worth, right? Your strong attitudes you're going to be very familiar with, you're going to know them very well, and you're going to have well-learned associations between that object and strong evaluations of it, right? Hearing about the object, the idea, whatever it is, automatically brings an evaluation to mind, right? A strong evaluation. And so this attitude accessibility, we now have this continuum between the weak and the strong attitudes. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. There are two key concepts with attitude accessibility, right? Accessibility itself being the degree to which the attitude is automatically activated from memory, right? So if you have stronger attitudes, they're going to be much more accessible and the activation is going to be much more automatic, right? If it's weaker, right, that activation is not going to happen as quickly. So the first key concept being accessibility. The second is the associations, which is links among the components of an attitude, right? So the associations, basically your stronger attitudes are going to have stronger associations, right? So when you combine the accessibility and the associations, that you can see how how that continuum between the weak attitudes and the strong attitudes works. And what studies have shown is that basically the frequency of mental rehearsal of associations is going to boost their strength. So if it's something that we're doing over and over and over again, right, that mental rehearsal, that's going to produce that automatic activation from memory. And so this is oftentimes why you see things in advertising and marketing and stuff. When they launch a campaign, they're not just doing a television commercial. They're doing several different television commercials. They're doing advertisements in magazines, radio advertisements, right? They might be doing some sort of event, right? There's lots of things that could be going on in order to enhance that mental rehearsal so people are seeing it over and over and over and over again, right? So those sorts of things have been shown in the research. There's also objects towards which we have accessible attitudes are going to better capture our attention, right? So if we have, right, these very accessible attitudes, they're automatically recalled quite quickly, they're going to capture our attention more because it's something we're more interested in, because we have more experience with it, where you can quickly access it. The accessible attitudes filter the way that we process information as well, right? So because of that filter, right, and the accessibility that we have, right, to automatically activate it from memory, that is going to, because it's so automatic, right? We don't have to think about it. We are going to filter information through that. And so that's, research tells us basically that that's going to be something that we have to think about, right, when we're trying to persuade people, is that if they already have this very strong attitude that's quickly assessed, right, or even a weak attitude, right, that's not quickly assessed, if we want to build a strong attitude toward our product, right, we want to make sure that they're able to filter the competition through that strong attitude that we have toward that particular product. So implicit attitudes are very interesting because they're occurring outside of our conscious awareness. So if we have strong implicit attitudes, we're not even necessarily consciously aware that we harbor certain feelings about a person or issue, right? So implicit attitudes basically are the equivalent of evaluations that have an unknown origin. They're activated automatically, and they influence uncontrollable responses. And so these are kind of interesting to look at because we don't even know where they've come from, right? So it could have been something that happened a long time ago, or something that was just kind of embedded and ingrained in us that we aren't even aware of. But it was some sort of repetitive exposure, likely because it's activated automatically, right? So when something happens, right, that association, it activates that attitude, right? And then there's an uncontrollable response that comes from that, right? So basically, they don't necessarily even view it as an expression of their attitude, and they don't even attempt to control it, is how that sort of uncontrollable response occurs. So they're kind of interesting, right? These implicit attitudes are habitual, right? And that goes back to that activated, that it's automatically activated, right? So they're going to emerge automatically in the absence of conscious thought. So we're not even going to know that we're doing it, saying it, thinking it, whatever. It's just going to happen without us knowing it, because it's just sort of ingrained in us without us even being aware of it. Other people have argued, of course, that maybe there are dual attitudes, right? So Timothy Wilson and his colleagues argue that people have dual attitudes, an explicit attitude and an implicit attitude, and that the explicit is what typically governs our behavior, but the implicit sometimes influences the uncontrolled responses we have. So if you've ever noticed that you've done something and you're like, why did I do that? And it was an automatic response to something. Sometimes people, and it could have been something that happened a long time ago, like in their childhood or something, but somebody will say something and it produces like an automatic defense mechanism. So something like that might be implicit, and they'd have a very strong attitude about that, but they may not know where it came from, okay? Some criticisms of this are that not all attitudes may have dual components. They may or they may not. People may not have dual attitudes at all, but instead just have one rather complex attitude that contains aspects that they are aware of and others that they're unaware of. There are also instances in which people are fully and proudly conscious that they hold strongly negative attitudes, and that's okay with them. An implicit attitude need not always be negative as well. It could be positive too. So a lot of times people talk about it in a negative light, but that's not necessarily the case. And the last aspect we're going to talk about with regards to strong attitudes is that of the neuroscience approach, right? The neuroscience approach is going to have this core assumption that everything psychological is also at the same time biological, that they are not separate entities, but they are linked together, okay? And that neurons are basically going to be facilitating the information processing. Our neurons are our nerve cells, which are the foundation of the nervous system, right? And they are the ones that are responsible for processing the information that we receive, whether it's hearing, seeing, speaking, touching, smelling, all of those senses that we have. So research has found that there has been a positive relationship between a type of strong attitude and the amygdala. The amygdala is that portion of the brain involved in processing threatening information. So if we have a strong attitude about something, it does produce activity in that portion of the brain that is processing threatening information, right? So if we see something that might be threatening to us, it's engaging that activity in that part of the brain. Other research, right, has found that neural activity in key regions of the brain was correlated with persuasion-produced behavior change, right? And so you can imagine, as people that might be professional persuaders, advertising, marketing, public relations, those sorts of things, knowing this neuroscience approach is kind of interesting, and of course would be something that they want to look into more, because especially if they can produce the behavior change that they're looking at. Right. With regard to the research, though, there is still not a definitive causal relationship between the mind and persuasion. So that relationship between the mind and brain activity is going to be very complex and unclear, and so they probably won't be able to ever definitively say one is causing the other. But they have found that there are relationships between them, right? And if you've ever taken a research methods course, you'll understand the causality issue there. And if you haven't, and you're a comm major, right, you'll eventually take it at some point, either with me or somebody else. So, anyhow, that's the neuroscience approach, and that's the end of the chapter on strong attitudes. So we will say see you later for now.